So today I thought we would talk about different ways to write. Oh, well, I didn't expect to see that in there. But we're going to talk about different ways to write the words just because. And so I have my pad of tracing paper here. And when you're trying to figure out your composition, tracing paper is going to be your absolute best friend. So we're going to write the words just because. I always like to sketch them up at the top of my page because then you can see certain things about the words. Like for instance, we've got a big letter at the beginning of both, right? A letter that is double the height of these regular letters. So if you have your lines, you are going to be up in the corner there. And a J would go half and half, and a U is just a half height letter, whereas a T is a full height letter. So your B is also a full height letter. Having those two right at the beginning will mean that your piece, if you were to stack those, let's just write that out, just in regular printing, you end up with quite a bit of intense letter right here and quite a bit of space in here. Sure, that can be filled with flourishing, but even before getting into anything like that, we want to look at how we can lay this out to avoid stacking these two. The other reason is because then, oh, thank you for the glitter tip nails, yes. The other reason is that then you're going to end up also with a space over here since the word just is not as long as the word because. So that means that we want to stagger these, either having them centered, so just because, or having it so that this is slightly to the left of because. And the reason we go for the left is because you always read your page from left to right, top corner to bottom corner. So we would want to have just here and then because over this way so that you're still following that way that we would read down a page. So that gives us our base for how we would consider putting these together. Of course, there are lots of lettering styles. So let's look at starting off with just a plain script. Keeping in mind these two options, let's start off with this one. I find that that allows a little bit of freedom just for that J right there to have some space to play out front. Started off with really simple and pretty consistent lettering. And you can see this is just, gotta stop using the word just. This is very plain lettering. It's not good, it's not beautiful, there's no flourishing. This is to give you a sense of where your piece will sit, spaces you can fill in, and even if that layout is going to work at all. So right now, we have just because really ugly. That's where you want to start. This will give you ideas of space that still needs to be filled in between these two. And it gives you ideas of maybe areas that could be flourished with letters that naturally would allow you to have those flourishes. So even though this is ugly, this is still a great base for doing your letters. And this is why I like tracing paper so much. Now, when you're using your tracing paper, don't always do the middle of the page for each little thing that you're doing, especially if you're testing out different styles. You want to be able to sort of print off or even sixteenth off your piece of paper so that you can fit a bit onto your page. You might also want to turn it so that the long side is on the top. Especially with something longer like this, it just means that you're going to be able to make better use of that paper. So our first style, let's make this fun. So by fun, I mean rather than it being these basic letters, which is what you learn when you first learn your basic strokes. We want to take it past that because composition is so much more than basic strokes. So instead, let's try to add some fun. And I typically like to think about a feeling when I'm doing my lettering. And the other thing is that using tracing paper like this is very much a part of my actual design process. You're not just seeing me pretend to do lettering here. This is exactly how I do it. At night, I like to pull out my tracing paper pad. I've actually just taken a few pads to Staples to get them like spiral bound so that I can make my own spiral bound tracing paper notebook, because that's how much I use tracing paper. And then I will take these exact steps and then go through and think of a feeling. So if this one is sort of like fun and bubbly, then you would want to do these little fun and bubbly twirls to your letters. So, and think about as well, adding that consistently throughout your piece. You might also notice that I like to go over my lines a few times, and that's because I find that if I do it forwards and backwards when I'm pencil lettering, it sort of allows me to better set those lines in there and also get a feel for what I'm trying to create. Like, do I really want this A to go down far because the C and the E also go that far? Or do I want this one to come up shorter to add more variety to the piece so that there's a bit more of a playful bounce through all of it? And then taking this S rather than this S right here, give it a little bit more play to it. And you can see that going back, rather than it being this tight on the S, I pulled it out to this far out because I just think that that then follows the same size of all of these curves that I used everywhere else. And let's add an E. And rather than have it go off into nowhere, we can sort of mimic these curves again by bringing it around a little bit. This one can be really tricky. So if you have difficulty with those strokes, then I say avoid doing this E curl. It can sometimes make the letter not look like the letter it's supposed to be. And then I like to go through and just erase those bits of the stroke that I've already decided that I don't want. And just like that, we have gone from a very basic style of just because to a playful and fun lettering style that still used this as the base. Basic strokes, I mean, it's messy, but then taking it to have a different sort of style. All right, another thing that we can do is continue this sort of style, you know, with a little bit of flair to it, but let's put it at an angle. So again, go back to your messy sheet. And when you put things at an angle, the layout can be a little bit different because they just end up sitting in a different location. If we were to do this centered, and it's at an angle, but of course your lettering still goes up and down. It just works its way up like it's going up a hill. If you try to center it, now your B is going to end up hitting the J. Whereas before, if we had centered it, the J, U, your B would end up being out here, and it would sit quite nicely. At an angle, that is more difficult, but it means that we can probably get these two a little bit closer together, moving that B in behind. Now I know I'm going fast because this is how I do composition. It's fast. It's also just testing things out because not everything is going to work. And if you do quite a few different ones, you're not setting yourself into one style. You allow yourself the freedom to say, I really don't like that one. But it also gives you practice coming up with lots of different styles. Okay, so we have our just because, and again, it's ugly. It's super basic, just with pencil, no up and down pressure. You don't need it yet. And let's take it back onto our sheet. So you want to look for areas again where there are empty spaces. So we might bring this S down, or even areas like this where there's an empty space that maybe we're going to fill in with a flourish. Now, when it's at an angle like this, if we were to draw, I'm actually doing this because I want to send out a bunch of cards this year. I think it's going to be really important just to continue to make those intentional connections with people. So I want to design a just because card, you know, just so I can send mail. I'm going to try to send 1 or 2 cards every week just to say hello to people and, you know, just because. So if this was a card design, which means that it has a rectangle around it, there's going to be empty space up here and down here as well. So you do want to consider what your final area is going to be to see how that would fit. Like here on a card, it's still going to have empty areas. You can always fill this in with a flower or something like that, of course, or just leave it. But for this one, I want to be intentional about trying to fill in that rectangle a little bit more. Okay, so bringing it back onto our better sheet of tracing paper. And just to let you know, I typically will do another sheet like this with all the different styles. And instead of feeling like this is the final one, I often will keep all of those different lines and then trace my finals onto another piece of tracing paper. And just to let you know, sometimes that means that I am going through like 5 pieces of tracing paper until I get to the final one, which can get confusing. So I like to put a little star beside the ones that like, okay, this is a keeper. Otherwise you're looking at them the next morning going, okay, which one of these was I supposed to be keeping? So let's look at this just because and see what we can do to make this one special. I'm going to try to make it a little bit more elegant than playful and fun like this. And I also noticed that this J could even connect and lead into the B. So setting up that connection there, I want to set it up right away so that I can try to work it in there. And that is going to mean that the U has to be adjusted. It can't come down so far or those 2 lines are going to hit. And I think the B needs to be about that tall. I think that it's important to be able to have that space in there so that the 2 letters aren't hitting. But if it's not tall enough, it's going to look like you squashed the B, which you never want to do because bees are lovely little creatures. So let's let all of our bees live and grow up to be nice and big and tall. And that means that this U is going to have to get adjusted. So even just shifting it up a little bit like that is still okay as long as the rest of our letters sort of follow this line. They just need to play around that line. So we'll bring it back down to the line with the S and then the T. You know what? I'm just going to maintain that line for this first go at it. So we have this space up here, which I'm going to try to fill in with a flourish, but typically I don't like to do that until the words are down because the flourish is not the most important part of your piece. The words are. You always want to make sure that those are priority. For you, it's like getting dressed and putting on all of your jewelry first. You don't want to accidentally forget to put your pants on and walk out of the house. I was just telling my kids last night the story about when I was lifeguarding, which I did for very many years when I was going through high school and university. And one time a woman walked out of the change room without her bathing suit on and went into the hot tub because she just didn't realize she hadn't put it on. So you don't want that to happen to your letters. Make sure that your letters are fully clothed and that they have their bathing suits on. Okay, let's do all of these. I'm just going to do them so they're going on the baseline. I typically don't do lettering on the baseline because most of my lettering, I like to make it fun or something like that. But sometimes, especially if you're trying to do something that's classier, you probably do want to work with a consistent baseline. I'm just going to make the U grow up a little bit because I noticed that the letters here are significantly taller than the letters on the first line. So that's something, it would be hard to fix in this first go, but I like to write myself a little note. So make half bigger. So these half height letters need to be made bigger. And just giving yourself a little note like that with sort of sketch lines is a good way to remind yourself of that for your next sketch, but not get bogged down on it with this first sketch. So to fill in this space up here, if I take this T and do like a huge flourish, it's going to become quite overwhelming. So instead, again, this one can be a little bit tricky to come over and fill in, but we can try sketching in something like this that fills in some of that space and then allowing this T flourish to fill in some of the space up here. And again, you can see I like to go back and forth. It allows me to sort of set where that line is going to go without being too committed to it. Put a dot in there. We don't want to forget that guy. And now I feel like it needs something underneath because we have so much flourish on top. So this space right here is kind of empty. Going in there and even doing something like this, that gives an idea of a more classy sort of flourished piece. It's still not a perfect rectangle, but that's okay. We're just getting ideas down on the page. Now these ended up being a little close together. I don't like to have them that close typically, but That's okay. We're trying to make the best use of our paper. All right. Another thing that can be really nice, especially when you have letters like this, where you have descenders and ascenders, and then you have a whole bunch of letters that don't have any ascenders. So that can be, I mean, this one just ends up standing out. It's like that song from Sesame Street where like one of these things is not like the other, one of these things just doesn't belong, and that would be that B right there. It's totally different. But we can make the rest of these be the same height by using capitals, right? That would make all of them grow up. So let's try doing something like that where we have our consistent height capitals. So rulers can be really helpful for the sketch time, just to make sure that you're consistent. Otherwise, typically, your letters will start to work their way up a little bit, or they get a little bit smaller. So having those sketching lines there can be super helpful. And we'll just quickly write in. And now just could go on top in capitals as well, but that's going to be a little bit boring. So maybe we'll keep just as a script. Now, just is tricky because we have an ascender here and we have a descender, and we don't want the descender to get into those letters. So you can try just making your descender shorter or try looping it into your letters, but let's see what happens when we actually start to sketch this out. So bringing it onto the page, just going to move it up a little bit here. And one thing I like to try to keep the bottom or top edge of my tracing paper consistent with that sketch line, because even if it's off just a little bit, you're writing, your brain is not going to be able to see this as being straight if your bottom line of your page is a little bit off. So try to keep it mostly straight. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. So let's write in some letters. And you want to make sure that your cross stroke for these letters, like the cross of the A and even these lines of the E, that it's consistent throughout the entire word. So I like to sketch in just that basic line so that I know where it's going to go for all of these letters, because the E's are in a totally different place. There we go, move it down. And even the C, shifting it so that that top bit comes down a little bit more, can help with that consistent drop in that cross stroke height. So the S, and we'll mimic this part of the C for the S. You want to look for those portions of your letters that are the same from letter to letter, and make sure that you are actually consistent with those elements and where they go to. That's even like making sure that the cross stroke of the A and the E and even where the B meets all end up being in the same place. So now we have because, and that's just a plain sans serif script right now, or we can add some serifs onto it to make it a little bit fancier. And if you don't know where your serifs go, one way that you can easily figure that out is print off the entire alphabet and look at where they place the serifs until you actually have them memorized or have your preferred serif in your mind. That's a good way to know where to put them all so that you're not constantly having to guess and put them in the wrong place. And then we have our just. So it's nice that it's already written a little bit squished, and we can go in and play around with where the because sits to make sure that that J actually works, and also to center it in the word because. So the J could come down and like loop like this around the E, which would be really nice, especially if it's written in a different color than the E. So actually I'm going to keep that. I thought I was going to make it shorter instead, but I think that's going to work. And bring the T down, or the S down, and I will connect it to the T just for consistency. And you also want to make sure, see how wide these letters are apart? This one's even too wide, but you want to be consistent. So get this one out there nice and wide as well. And then how close does it come to your letter? So bring it down here and then have it come back up to sort of the same height and the same extension on both sides of your line there. or so like the E ends here, we have that much coming out the side. The B ends here, we have that much coming out the side. You want it to be relatively consistent. Now, because we have the straight line here and straight lines in these letters, you could very easily just do a straight line for just as well to help tie the two together, rather than doing a flourish that mimics these guys, but that just means that you're not tying that top word into what you have on the bottom word. Oh, a woodpecker just came to the tiny bird feeder right at the window. That's a nice little visit. Okay, let's look at, you know what, let's take this capital idea a little bit further, but I want to stop them all from being capitals and maybe try mixing it up a little bit. So I'm going to stick with this sketch right here because we already have a little bit of a line. Oh, I don't need a new piece. What am I thinking? That's getting in the way. There we go. A nice dramatic paper tear. And keep the height of these ones, but I think mixing it up so that some of them are print, some of them are script. I always like doing that a lot. Can make it a little bit more playful again. So for this one, the feeling is playfulness. And getting some nice curly letters and even adding a bit of a serif to a letter that you wouldn't necessarily expect it on can be a good way to do that. So we have capitals. Who knows? This could be a capital or a lowercase. So let's do another lowercase here, but make it nice and tall. We want to fill in that full line height. All right, and this U. And even with the U, before with the serif that we did, we were very straight on these lines and it was consistent. Whereas for playing around and making it a bit more fun, having that at a slight curve is going to really help to push that idea even a little bit further. And so for the S, we want to try to get a little bit more of a curl to it. And that also can help to mimic the curl that we have going on here. And mimicking some of those elements throughout really allows you to have a piece that looks consistent and cohesive, which is so important. Now, it doesn't always have to be the exact same, like this one could even loop up like this, but it's the same sort of element where you have this curl, it's just that it's been extended a little bit further. So it's the same element. Now, because this curl is on this side, we might want to do like a curl coming off of the B, just to help balance out the fact that we have a bit of a flourish on this side and this side was super straight. All right, now what do we do for just above? Again, we could try doing a whole other style. Let's even, I'm just gonna move this down a little bit so I can use this as a baseline here. And you can even try doing a very simple style. Sans serif with the letters spaced out and a bit straighter. And they might not be perfectly placed, but that's because we're really pushing it here with trying something different. And this would be very cute, even with having like a line going in between that's consistent with all of those. Make it come out this side as well, because of course you want it to be even on both sides. And there's another design. This would actually work really well within a rectangular card. So kind of keeping your end goal in mind can be really helpful when you're coming up with these designs. Now I notice that it's not perfectly centered, this right here. So I like to give myself a little mark like this, just telling myself where to shift this middle word for the next time that I trace. And again, when you're coming up with all these different composition ideas, don't worry about them being perfect, just get lots of ideas down on the page. But having a few guidelines to start with can be incredibly helpful for getting your ideas down. So now I also like this one quite a bit, but I'd like to push it a little bit further. And you can do that thinking like, I love the idea of all the flourishes here, but I want it to still have this fun lettering style. So taking even inspiration from the things that you've done is a really nice way to push your composition a little bit further and see, you know, what other ideas you can come up with. So maybe we don't want a J that falls so far down below here. let's try doing like a capital J. And I noticed that Linda just said it's a great idea to use a shorter sort of word or a short phrase like this, not even just a single word, but two, to work on your composition, because it will allow you the freedom to make mistakes without feeling like you've invested so much time and energy into it, because that can just be very disheartening. And we are not doing our lettering because we want to waste our time or feel disheartened or not like what we create. And if you do lots of tiny little things, who cares if you throw some of them out? Or even who cares if you find a few that you like and you keep using those ones? You can use these in many different places. You might want to do a few different versions of a Just Biz card. And this is a really good way to get that done. Okay, so we haven't tried, oh no, I'm off the page. All right, we'll just move that over a little bit. Fold. I liked this start of the just with the top heavy S, a little something different, but I was running off the page. So we talked about having a piece where it was centered, so the just is centered on the B, and we didn't do that with the script. So then that's another thing that you can totally try out. Now, a capital J would be a good idea or a good way to sort of move it up so that the J isn't coming into the space of the word below. So that capital, then sometimes I even like to play with other capitals, even if it doesn't necessarily make sense. So let's do a capital B. And of course, there are different styles of capital B, so you can do whatever you want, but I'm keeping in mind, like I want it to be sort of elegant, playful, flourished. So keep in mind what your goal is. And even sometimes I'll write down here the lettering style that I'm trying to come up with. So like elegant, playful, and then I want flourishing. So writing those down can really help you to get those sorts of ideas. So Jillian, that's a very good point. I have an entire course all about coming up with composition and really going into the how and why of making every single one of these decisions. It's called the Intermediate Masterclass. And in that, we go through so many compositions like this a week of different varying lengths, different styles of lettering. And that's what that one's all about. I will put a link to that one so that you can sign up for the wait list. I don't run it very often just because it is very intensive. I'm going to put a flourish on the top now to balance out the one on the bottom. It's very intense, and we also go through and look at student pieces to look at what's working really well and what needs to be changed up a little bit. Like this, now it's losing its T-ness because I've curled this around and I've curled this around and it's starting to look like a who even knows what. So where you get lots of gently loving critical feedback on your piece to make sure that things like legibility are super clear, because that is very important. So even just taking some of that flourish off of the top of the T helps to go through and make sure that it's more of a T and less of a question mark in people's minds. Legibility is always so important. And so I'm noticing that this U to the S combination might not be as legible as it should be. So switching that up. Now, the scale of this flourish is much bigger than the scale of this one. This one ended up really tight and small. So let's scale that up even. This is how I end up with piles of tracing paper down by my bed every single night, because I just like to sketch these out and try new ideas. And I find if I'm doing it when I'm, getting ready for bed, not getting ready for bed. Yeah, I do this while I brush my teeth. But I find that if I'm doing this, in the evening, just watching TV, relaxed, rather than in my designated creative time, then you lose that pressure of things having to be perfect every single time. You don't have to worry about it. Who cares if the pile beside your bed gets ginormous? It doesn't really matter. All right, so this, I feel like this flourish needs a bit of work. It's still too small for the scale. There we go. But that is a very quick overview of how you can get this. So I'm going to go through and make a few of these, start to send out to people. And again, I will link to the intermediate masterclass. I know some people watching here have actually gone through it, and that's why they're saying, no, this feels like the masterclass, because we do so many of these things live. So I will link to that so that you can get your name on the wait list if you are interested in looking intensely at your composition and making sure that you're able to create pieces that you are absolutely in love with, so that during actually the process of it brings you joy rather than it just being a chore. This is something that brings me so much happiness, fitting these letters together like a puzzle, finding new and unique ways to create and putting something beautiful into the world that then can go and have a purpose, like this becoming a card that I will send to people to connect. Because this year for me, it's all going to be about connecting. And I hope that it's given you some ideas for how you can make beautiful pieces to be able to connect with the world around you as well. Until next time, I will see you shortly. I hope you have an absolutely wonderful week.